It also comes as Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska expresses her concerns about McConnell's plans for the Senate, revealing at least one potential crack in Republican support for President Trump as the Senate ponders what to do. Murkowski said she is uncomfortable with McConnell's comments that he plans to be, quote, in total coordination with the White House over a trial.
Well, and in fairness, when I heard that, I was disturbed. And if we are tasked as the full Senate to do impartial justice under the Constitution and the law, to me, it means that we have to take that step back from being hand in glove with the defense. And so I heard what Leader McConnell had said. I happen to think that that has further confused the process.
Murkowski is one of several wild cards in the Senate, and while she remains publicly undecided, she stressed that she takes her role as an impeachment juror seriously.
I need to be able to sit back and look at both sides of this, both what the House managers will present and what the White House managers will present. I need to do that. That's what I am going to do. I'm going to sit back and look at that and judge fairly and fully and honestly. So for me to prejudge and say there's nothing there, or on the other hand, he should be impeached yesterday, that's wrong. In my view, that's wrong.
For more, I'm joined by Sonam Sheth, political correspondent for Business Insider, Republican strategist Susan Del Percio, and Richard Ben-VENISTE, who served as assistant Watergate prosecutor. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Richard, let me just start with you. In terms of this sort of public standoff here between the House, the Democratic-controlled House, the Republican-controlled Senate, what Trump is doing and saying publicly today, the day after Christmas, going after Nancy Pelosi with the words he's going after her with. In terms of Pelosi's posture in that standoff, how will this affect it? Will it affect it at all?
No, it's just another tweet tantrum that the president is fond of employing, attacking, bullying, making fun of people. He's just the master of this kind of disruptive and over-politicizing process. Senator Murkowski gives us a breath of fresh air and actual stating of the obvious. If you're going to have a trial, you should have witnesses. You should have access to evidence. You shouldn't have a president saying, oh, you're going too slow now before you were going too fast. It sounds like the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. What was too fast about the impeachment? Didn't he have time, the president, to give a sworn statement if he wanted to? Didn't he have time to release the witnesses who he has told could not testify? All of this makes no sense at all in terms of getting to the truth of what actually happened so that reasonable people can then make judgments about it.
Sonam, in terms of the Democrat strategy here in withholding this, at least for now, from the Senate, one of the ideas that has been advanced is that basically that'll make Trump squirm, this idea that, hey, the House has impeached him. There is no immediate acquittal forthcoming from the Senate. That reaction from him to that reality would somehow then force McConnell's hand, force Republicans' hands in the Senate. Do you see any indication of that at all in what he's saying now, or is this somebody who's going to sort of be taking this posture no matter what?
Well, I think it's really interesting to look at his reaction because we have to remember that this is the first time in his entire life that Donald Trump is being held publicly accountable for something. This isn't a lawsuit that he can just settle and sweep under the rug. And his ranting and raving about it is kind of indicative of the fact that he hasn't dealt with this before. And so for Pelosi to withhold those articles, from the Democrats' perspective, was likely meant to box Trump in and to not give him the one thing that he wants most, which is, quote, total and complete exoneration, which is what he would look forward to from the Senate. So as long as Pelosi and the Democrats withhold these articles, there is absolutely nothing that Trump can do to bend them to his will. And I think that That's why we're seeing him kind of unravel and come unhinged in real time.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.